is still 27% for African Americans, of African American children. I am honored to introduce Andrea Miller, who is a prominent civil rights activist for the Equal Rights Amendment, spokesperson on voting rights, and co-executive director of Progressive Democrats of America, which is the sponsoring organization for today at this Progressive Roundtable for PDA. So Andrea Miller, thank you.
Thank you very much. 22 states have enacted laws that restrict voting. Race was a significant factor of the 11 states with the highest African American turnout in 2008. 7 have placed new restrictions on voting. Of the 12 states with the highest Hispanic turnout or Hispanic growth between 2009 and 2010, 9 of these states have passed laws making it harder to vote, and nearly 2/3 of the states, or 9 out of the 15, previously covered in whole or partially by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because they had a history of blatant racial discrimination in voting, have new restrictions since the 2010 election. Social science studies bear this out. According to the University of Massachusetts Boston study, states with higher minority turnout were more likely to pass restrictive voting laws. A University of California study suggests that legislative support for voter ID laws were motivated by racial bias. For those of you who want to read the full report by the Brennan Center for Justice, you can Google Brennan Center for Justice, the State of Voting 2014. Additionally, we still have a tremendous issue for people who have felony convictions in their past. There are 5 million American citizens who have lost their right to vote because of a past felony conviction. There are 4 states, Florida, Virginia, Iowa, and Kentucky, where if you have a felony in your past, you can only get your voting rights restored individually by the governor. So one of the things that we are definitely going to be looking at as we look at expanding the voting franchise is ways that we can rectify the new Jim Crow laws that we are seeing since 2010 and reversing the laws that have taken the vote away from people with former felony convictions. Now, it's very interesting to note, thank you very much, but that really doesn't help. I'll just be choking on the water and coughing. So like I said, I'm just going to sound weird, but I'll keep going. All right. As part of our Southern strategy, PDA is launching a new campaign called Promoting Household Stability. And our campaign is going to create a structure where we can join a lot of the PDA issues together. So when we look at civil rights in the 21st century, we are looking at full employment, making sure that people have jobs. We must look at housing. Do people have affordable housing? How can you create household stability if you don't have a house? We're going to be looking at voting rights. People must be able to vote to determine what is going to be the laws that govern the society in which we live. We must look at protecting Social Security and Medicare so that people who have spent a lifetime working as they reach their senior years are going to be financially able to support themselves and live in dignity. We also must ensure, as part of household stability, right.
Have you got the message yet, Andrea?
All right, yeah, you want me to drink water and cough, okay, right. All right. We also must make sure, again, in order to promote household stability, that we have clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and we have an environment that is safe. We also must look at what's happening with our education system, and finally, households cannot be stable if people are strangling with student debt. So these are a number of the issues that over the months in the South, you will see us putting these programs together. Now, there is no movement. I don't get to go to that yet. The other part of our Insight strategy is going on today. In over 280 congressional offices, we have PDA members delivering letters to their House and Senate members of Congress, asking them to support voting rights. We are asking the members to join on to or co-sponsor H.R. 12 in the House, Senate Bill 123, the Voter Empowerment Act. We are also, for our House people, asking them to support Representative Ellison's same-day registration and voter access protection, which would basically outlaw photo ID. We are also asking people to support Representative Conyers' H.R. 1000, Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Training Act. It's a bill at PDA that I like to call the Jobs for Everyone Who Wants One bill. Additionally, we also have a reintroduction of the Democracy Restoration Act in both the House and the Senate. Nothing exemplifies PDA's concept of the outside strategy more than the Moral Monday movement. And I am delighted to welcome Reverend Rodney Sadler, who is visiting us today from North Carolina to talk to us about the Moral Monday movement. Reverend Sadler officially today joined PDA's advisory board. So Reverend Sadler, please join us.
Move that mic.
And I'm going to.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Michael, for this invitation to be with you today. I have to admit to you that this role for me is somewhat new. You see, last year, this time, a little bit earlier last year, I was not much of an activist in the way that I am today. Before May 6th of 2013, I was quite a comfortable, socially accepted activist. I usually spoke regularly with liberal and conservatives in churches across North and South Carolina. I talked often about issues like race and poverty and works on boards of groups that address these issues, but was not actively involved in wrestling with these issues. It was not until May 6th of 2013 that things really began to change. I began to see what the world was like as I began to participate in this new civil rights movement that we call the Moral Monday movement. On this day, I went from my comfortable home in the suburbs of Charlotte to a cold and isolated jail cell in Raleigh, North Carolina, as I surrendered myself for civil disobedience, or as I like to call it, moral obedience. A little background on myself: I am a tenured African-American biblical scholar. I have pretty much everything I need in my life. As a seminary professor in the oldest seminary in the South, I have access to excellent health care. I am a tenured professor, so usually, most nights, I don't give much concern for unemployment or unemployment benefits, because I can afford to live in what most people would call a good neighborhood. I don't have to worry about my daughter's education, because she goes to one of the best schools in the state of North Carolina. I have all the requisite IDs that I need to vote, and have had them since I was a teenager. But you see, this is where the new civil rights movement comes into being. It is no longer just about my rights. It is about all of our rights. As an African American, I have to admit that this new civil rights struggle really is not just about race, even though many of the people negatively impacted by current policies are African American and Latino. This new civil rights movement really is not just about class, even though many of the people negatively impacted will be from the poor and lower middle classes. This new civil rights movement really is about lifting up the rights and the dignity of all humanity. I have to say that I've often been disappointed by the way that people have traditionally thought about the civil rights movements in the 1950s and 60s, particularly in the way that people have understood the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Though Dr. King is clearly a civil rights leader, most people have mistakenly thought that his concern was only to transform the nature of the way black people live their lives in this world. But if the way that we define civil rights is just about black people's rights, we've missed the larger point of what civil rights were all about and what Dr. King was really working for. That's why people were so disappointed when Dr. King began to fight for the rights of those who were impoverished. He called it the Poor People's Campaign. Those who put him in the box of a black civil rights thinker thought he stepped outside of his box. That's why people were so disappointed when he began to work against the war in Vietnam. They did not see this as a civil rights issue, i.e. a black issue. But Dr. King was concerned about far more than just the rights of black people, however important the rights of black people may be. I think to understand Dr. King, you have to understand this passage that seems to so motivate him from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, where human beings were said to have been created in the image of God. Here, in the midst of that story, we see a larger understanding of the fact that we are all important as human beings. We are special as human beings because we're sacred as we're made in the image of God. This is not a simple statement that should be easily ignored. It is a statement that says that human life is inherently valuable because there is something of God reflected in us. It is a statement that says, according to Genesis 9, verse 6, that we are to protect other human beings' lives because there is a sacred kernel within us. It is a statement that confirms the fact that we are great not because of what we do, not because of where we live, not because of the color of our skin, not because of the way we worship or where we worship or the nation of our origin or anything else about us. We are important because God has imprinted God's indelible stamp on our very being, on us. As I reflect on this reality, I want to emphasize that means that the way that we treat each other is in essence the way that we would treat God if God were in our midst. In this regard, I think that the ultimate concern of the new civil rights movement is not a human rights issue, i.e. an anthropological concern. It is a matter of the way that we treat God, i.e. a theological concern. We have to begin to develop policies that treat human beings in the way that we would treat God, God's self, if God were in our midst. For in fact, God really is in our midst, as reflected in each of us. In this regard, getting back to the larger civil rights issues of today makes more sense. We need to make sure, therefore, that all people have the dignity of a job at a living wage. We need to make sure that all people have the dignity of a home to lay their heads at the end of a hard day's work. We need to make sure that all people have the dignity of health care and quality education and an opportunity to advance in their lives. These things are not just simple concerns, they are ultimate concerns. The way that we treat the least, the lost, and the otherwise left out matters, not just to them, it matters to God, and therefore it should matter to us. We need to begin to develop a theology that works for us on Monday through Friday, not just on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday when we go to our places of worship. Let me say it this way. For those of us who are Christians, we need to take Jesus outside the doors of the church and introduce him to the world. Amen. The new civil rights movement is a movement to reclaim the inherent worth of all human beings, and the theological concern that motivates us is to make sure that this representation of God in each human being is protected. In addition, I think this new humanist struggle is more than just a humanist struggle. It links us all in this larger divine network to make sure that we have adequate housing, living wage, equal education, quality health care, and a strong environment, because as we ensure all of these things, we are ensuring human life. If I were to say one other thing about this movement, of this new civil rights movement, it's that I think that we have to begin to change the narrative that we have in our society about the poor. You see, if we look at the Bible, the poor, the orphans, the widows, the afflicted, those with health issues are always lifted up as sacred, as a protected group, as special to God, as special in society. But it seems that somehow or another, since 1980, we found a way to make these protected groups the villains. We have attributed their poverty to the lack of their ability or their willingness to work. We've contributed this to a general notion of their laziness or their moral deficiency. We have blamed the victims. Instead of recognizing that it is morally problematic to have a population where 7% of the population is currently unemployed, that leaves hundreds of thousands of people homeless, that leaves millions of people without quality health care, and that leaves tens of millions of people without a decent education in a technological society, we have found a way to blame the very victims of this for their own fate. Instead of recognizing this as a moral problem that we have created, we've made the poor morally problematic. We've made the poor, the victims of this system, those who are thought to be responsible in order to protect the notion that our meritocracy actually works. But we know that that's not true. We know that people are often at a disadvantage because of their race or their class or their educational attainment. We know that often these are the issues that we as a nation control, that often shape people's outcomes. There's an old Victor Hugo quote that I remember. I probably will butcher it, so I'll paraphrase it, if you will. If a soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not the one who commits the sins, but the one who causes the darkness. You see, we have caused the darkness of poverty. We have caused the darkness of racial disparity. We have caused the darkness of a lack of education, and therefore we are responsible for the sin of poverty that is afflicting our people. My brothers and sisters, it's now time for us to turn on the light. My brothers and sisters, it's now time for us to work to create greater household stability by working on these issues that leave people in their wake. My brothers and sisters, it's now time for us to take on a new civil rights movement and make sure that all of God's people created in God's image have access to a decent life and to equal rights. My brothers and sisters, it's time for us to make sure that every human being made in God's image has adequate housing, adequate education, adequate health care, a quality life, with a quality job, with a living wage, in a good and safe environment. We need to do this not just because it's a good democratic ideal, and I know I'm talking to the progressive Democrats. We need to do it not just because it's the right thing to do. We need to do it not just because it's a progressive ideal. You see, we need to do it because it is the divine thing to do. And this is the point I want to make as I close today. We need to do it because it is the divine thing to do. We cannot be truly humane unless we recognize the lingering divinity that persists within us all, and begin to treat people as though they are special, as though they are worthy, as though they deserve all the benefits that this good society can offer to them. Amen.
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 Thank you, Dr. Sadler. Thank you.
That was a powerful invocation, Reverend. I just
thank you.
wondered, just kind of as a question for you, because I think you pose a profound challenge to this group to take on a different kind of activism,
Yes.
both in terms of its inspiration and its message, and also its work to put ourselves, our own bodies on the line through what you called moral obedience.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about that to you, the significance of that, the civil disobedience, the moral obedience that has characterized Moral Mondays?
I think if I can be distinctly Christian for a moment here, and when I say being distinctly Christian, I know I'm standing in a larger Judeo-Christian context in which many of the people in our country can resonate, but I'm going to speak for my own particular. Jesus said, if you will be my disciple, you must take up your cross daily and follow me. This notion of taking up your cross daily is a notion of self-sacrifice on behalf of others. I think we need to recognize that. And I think the work of the PDA is already leaning in that direction. We're already leaning in that direction towards finding ways to help people, particularly those who are otherwise abused in the society. I think we can begin to do this in part by engaging with the larger religious community. By saying, how do we get those values that motivate people in your sanctuaries to help to motivate them as they stand in the public sphere, as they legislate in places like this, as they participate in governance in the administrative branch, and as they go to vote on Tuesdays in their own localities. So if we can begin to do this,
Right.
I think we can begin to affect the larger dynamic here in the nation.
I think that's, again, a very resonant notion that you're evoking a tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition that is inclusive and
Yes.
hopeful.
Yes.
And we hear so much an aspect of that tradition that would be maybe the opposite, one
Yes.
could characterize it as. And you offer just a much more, I think, a powerful vision of what it could represent for fundamental change in this country.
I appreciate that, and I think one of the things I've always worried about is that for some reason, since 1980, we've the development of the quote-unquote moral majority movement, we've reduced religion to having three concerns. We're against gays and marriage, we're against we're for prayer in schools, and we're against abortion. The Bible perhaps says very little about these things, if anything. But the Bible in almost every page talks about justice.
Yes.
It talks about righteousness. It talks about the widows. We call them single mothers.
Right.
It talks about orphans. We call them fatherless children. It talks about those who are unemployed. They call them the praktoi, the pataktoi, the utterly destitute in the Hebrew Scriptures. It talks about those people who are maimed and who have the inability to function fully. We see these people in our own society. And these people are people that are lifted up as those who are to be protected. Our society is supposed to work in their favor. But somehow or another, we've made it a bad thing
Right.
to be part of this group.
Right, exactly.
A group that no one wants to join necessarily, that they end up being according to. So I think that in part what this Moral Monday movement, in part with our larger theme is how do we begin to say, let's look at the rest of what our scriptural traditions say,
Right.
and let's bring these concerns, these messages out to the fore. And let's see if we take these ideas to Washington, if it changes the way that we legislate, if it changes the way that we govern.
Well, let's hope it does.
Amen.
Absolutely.
Amen.
And I know I was thinking, Andrea, of Tim Carpenter,
Yes.
who sadly, passed away at the end of April, who very much embodied this in his own life, the image that you invoke of self-sacrifice, of that kind of personal commitment. He started out in the peace movement and very much in the Catholic worker tradition in
Yes.
his case. And so we see a continuation of that tradition within PDA with your presence here, so we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry I never got to meet him, but I appreciate the fact that that witness was already here, and may we continue that witness as we go forward.
Absolutely.
God bless.
Well,
Thank you.
I have one other question. The Moral Monday movement, while it began in North Carolina, it is growing outside North Carolina.
Yes.
So Reverend Sadler, can you talk about some of the new locations where we're seeing Moral Mondays?
Yes. Let me make a plug for one of my good friends, William Barber, who is the leader of this movement, Moral Monday, who really has been working behind the scenes for the last 7-8 years to pull this together, and who really is bringing this movement to the fore. Dr. Barber has been traversing the country, going back and forth from places like Florida to Mississippi to Alabama to Tennessee, Virginia, and Missouri, and making sure that this message gets out, and telling people that you need to be able to mobilize your own movement in your own context and see what your own issues are. But think about these current core issues. What are these core concerns that are being that are in contest, and how do we begin to address these through this larger moral framework? And this movement is catching on. This movement is developing, and I hope this movement begins to transform not only our individual states but our entire body politic.
And I'm hopeful for that too. One of the other things that we've seen is more and more references to budgets as moral documents.
Amen. Thank you.
So I remember when I first heard Reverend Barber mention that, and then when the Progressive Caucus released the Better Off budget, then again, we really started to hear these references. And I think it's really important that we look and judge laws, concepts on those terms.
Yes.
Does it help other people or does it hurt people?
Yes.
As opposed to, is it just good for me?
Amen.
Which is what some folks are trying to say. Look at, is it good for me, then it's good. So we really have to look at what you say is really that real moral imperative. What is good for others?
Thank you. And I love this notion that we need to get beyond voting for our own self-interest. The odd thing about it is far too often that people in our nation aren't even voting for their interests. They're voting against their interests. If they're in the poor and middle classes and voting for some of this conservative ideology that is utterly harmful to their own status in life. So I think that we need to get people to think about what their own issues are, but also to vote, to vote not just for our interest, but for the larger interest. What is the common good? What is the common weal, the good that we all need as a nation? How can we begin to work for this? Dr. Barber tells a wonderful story about the fact that the newspapers would always call him when there's an issue that seems to be a moral dispatched issue, and not call him when it was a budgetary concern. And that's how that notion of budgets are moral concerns. What we spend our money on, the choices that we make in this regard are moral concerns. How do we bring this all into this framework? I was at had a wonderful opportunity to be at the White House the other day and hear an Episcopalian priest, Sister McCann from Missouri, make the statement that it has to pass the dignity test.
Yes.
Does it affirm human dignity? And if it affirms human dignity, then we should do it. And if it diminishes human dignity in any way, then this is not a law that we should pass. This is not a bill we should support. This is not an issue that we should champion.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
Reverend.
Reverend Sadler.
God bless.
So we have it's a number of members of Congress that we expect to join us today, but they also have their regular responsibilities includes voting, and so who knew? But yes, they do have votes on the floor, and so that will determine when they arrive and whether they can join us today. So we're hopeful that they will be able to get here, and we know that Representative Ellison, one of his staff, came by and said that he will be here as soon as his schedule permits. So we look forward to that as well.
Well, Michael, why don't you talk about the Robin Hood tax campaign, since that provides so much of the financial underpinnings that we need for many of our other pieces of legislation.
I would be happy to. And I was really struck, Reverend, by your, a number of things you said, but one of them really resonated for me because I work with the National Nurses United and work with nurses who really bring that kind of moral calling to their work.
You'll come to North Carolina soon.
Well, yes, we have, we have been asked to do that and we want to, very much. And it's, and so really the nurses enact their values on a day-to-day basis, and we like to talk about the caring and compassion and community that is central to what nurses do. And it really does, I think, fall into the concept of promoting human dignity, because you're in a situation like in a hospital where there's a real potential to lose your dignity. I mean, literally, right, as you confront those health crises. And so the nurse's ability to maintain that for their patients and that sense of dignity under those very difficult circumstances it motivates and informs how they go out in the world and do advocacy. Their social advocacy is very much inspired by that experience of maintaining and promoting human dignity and bringing those values to bear. And so when the National Nurses United got engaged with the Robin Hood tax campaign, it was very much in response to the economic crisis, so that the dignity that literally people were losing in their communities when they lose a job, lose a home, when they can't afford to put food on the table for their families. And nurses themselves individually were asked to pay for the necessities of life. And that really meant that the resources that the nurses earned were ones that were sustaining a much larger group, and that ultimately was a burden that needed to be broadened socially, in their view, that really the society, it's a rich society we live in. The economy is producing huge rewards for the few. How do we spread that out? And that's ultimately the Robin Hood message. Some people say, hey, well, you know, what are you talking about Robin Hood? He was a criminal. Well, no, Robin Hood, let's remember, Robin Hood was taking it back, right? It was the illegitimate authorities that had taken it from the people, and he was restoring the balance by returning those resources that the people had earned to themselves for their benefit. And so the Robin Hood tax is essentially the same thing, that the finance sector has gotten disproportionate rewards. Thomas Piketty is very popular now as an economist. What he tells you is the reason that the driver really of inequality is that the finance sector and rewards of finance and invested capital far outstrip the rewards of labor. That labor is not rewarded to the same extent that finance is rewarded, and that drives inequality to a large extent. And so the Robin Hood tax is an equalizer to say, yeah, their capital's getting disproportionate rewards, we need a piece of that, and the only way socially to recover that is through a tax. That's our mechanism to recover and to establish a balance and greater equality. So the tax, as you say, Andrea, would be used to fund living wage jobs. Yes. Would be used to fund affordable housing, health care for all. It's a part of H.R. 676, for example, which is a improved Medicare for all bill, funded in part by a financial transaction tax. It's a sales tax. It's straightforward. We buy shoes, we pay sales tax. These folks buy and sell millions, billions of dollars of shares in companies, and they don't pay a sales tax. That's unfair. This is a small sales tax, 0.5%. We're paying 8, 9% in some cases, 0.5% on stocks, 0.1% on bonds, less on derivatives. Raises up to 350 billion a year. Big number, a number that's big because the volume of trading and buying and selling is so large. Why do high-frequency traders, which has been in the news, make so much money? Because they get ahead of the market. They're able to conduct a trade in their interest ahead of other traders. Well, this tax actually would make those trades unprofitable. So we would reduce the ability of high-frequency traders to scam the market. That's a positive regulatory effect in addition to the revenue. When we talk about the Robin Hood tax, we're talking about H.R. 1579. That's Keith Ellison. If he can join us today, it's his bill, author of it. broad international movement. You've got the New York Times editorializing in favor of financial transaction tax. You have religious leaders, both the leading organization of Catholic priests and nuns support it. Leading Jewish leaders support it as well. This is a movement that has broad ecumenical support, as a matter of fact. It's also supported by conservatives. The conservative chancellor of Germany is for it. 11 European countries are moving forward with a version of this tax. This is a relatively mainstream idea where taxation is understood as a way to equalize the distribution of social wealth. Some people consider that a radical notion. Others consider it a moral notion and a relatively conservative notion that promotes stability in society and greater equality. So in that sense, it has great momentum internationally. It's good momentum domestically because of some of the work that has been done around the high-frequency trading. It's got more prominence. We have also seen more co-sponsors on H.R. 1579 here in Congress. So there is this growing momentum, and I think when the European countries fully adopt it next year, American traders are going to be in a unique position of being taxed and that money going to European countries. So again, that may change the dynamic, one would think. Also,
One would hope.
The Conyers bill that you referenced has a financial transaction tax
Right,
in it as
H.R.
well.
1000,
H.R.
yes, it
1000
does.
as a funding mechanism.
Yes.
So that's the beauty of what we say about the Robin Hood tax. Two things. One is it's not a tax on the people, it's a tax for the people. And secondly, it's not an issue that you need to work on instead of your issue. It's an issue that can help you achieve what you're organizing for. And that is the age-old question to progressives, well, how do you pay for it? Here is your answer. And it's a powerful one, we hope.
Len?
Yeah, just one other comment to that, which I really think is very important, also that HR 1000 is funded, completely by a financial transaction tax. It's good for the economy. What we've seen is these bubbles of speculation that drive money away from creative activities, create bubbles, burst, and destroy the economy and destroy jobs. So this is something that is a tax on speculation that is for people, and I think, and for the economy. So it's something that would help the economy. I think that's important.
Michael?
My understanding is that the United States had a financial transaction tax from the World War I era all the way up into the Vietnam era. And that was the time when we had some of our greatest economic expansion and growth of the Opportunity Society, middle class. So for people who say that this would be hurting growth, I think that history shows the opposite.
It absolutely does. You're right. It was a tax in place from 1914 to 1966. It's a tax actually that's still on the books in New York State. They don't actually, they collect it but refund it essentially as a kind of ledger transaction on paper. But it would generate $13 billion a year in New York State alone at their level of taxation. It was ended in 1966 as part of a deal that Lyndon Johnson cut around the tax increase to fund the Vietnam War. So yet another casualty, like the Great Society, I guess.
Yes.
Of that war, of that tragic war.
And disabled. A few months later, with a major contribution by the United States, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights was passed. That covenant indicated that everyone should have access to health care services so that the highest attainable health could be obtained. It further indicated that nations should provide the resources and make them available in the most cost-effective manner as possible. That covenant, passed in 1976, though brought to Congress, has never passed. The U.S. belief in individual, in contrast to governmental responsibilities for health, remains a major barrier to health as a right in the United States. For that right to be manifest, one needs universal health insurance. Other than those entitled by virtue of age, Medicare, vulnerable and young, S-chip, and those sick and poor, people in the United States get access to health care by private insurance. Resulted in our having some 50 million people uninsured, a major driver to have a reluctant Congress finally pass the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act, however, is built on the concept of individual responsibility. Health care is mandated, but you have a choice. You don't have to do it. It enables people to meet the mandate through expanding Medicaid, but the Supreme Court has indicated that's a state choice, and half the states at this point have chosen not to make that choice. The ACA also provided health exchanges for people without other access to insurance and for people to obtain subsidized health insurance. It encourages and facilitates employers to provide health insurance. But the health insurance that's being provided in these latter mechanisms, the health exchanges and through employers, is private health insurance. Private health insurance has a concern, has a responsibility to constrain their costs, to assure their profitability. This is done increasingly by high out-of-pocket costs, deductibles, coinsurance. Affordable health insurance, then, means insurance with high out-of-pocket costs. Million uninsured remaining. By relying on private health insurance, it assures that there are financial barriers to the use of services, and these barriers discriminate on the basis of income. For us to realize health as a human right, it can be done incrementally by improving the mandate or by moving to single-payer health insurance. If we were to move incrementally, the historic tradition of the United States, we're talking about trying to have the states finally all accept Medicaid, broaden the definition of Medicaid so that more people can be insured through public resources, broadening the accessibility to Medicare, a more cost-efficient way of providing health care being a single-payer system. We could limit out-of-pocket charges. We could make the mandate a requirement, as some other countries do. We could raise the subsidy for health insurance. But all of these mechanisms, save broadening Medicare eligibility, means strengthening and relying upon private health insurance. States, more likely at this point in time than the federal government, are likely to consider single payer as an option. Vermont has passed a mechanism for considering and hopefully implementing a single payer type system. Vermont came to that point as a result of many years of discussion of the Vermont population, 95% of whom ultimately accepted health as a human right. The human right advocacy, the human right language was seminal, essential in having the Vermont come to a political acceptance of single payer. Maryland, my state, has followed suit. After advocating for single payer, which we continue to do, we've supported and initiated a human rights campaign to educate the Maryland population to the need for health as a human right. So in summary, the attainment of human rights in health requires universal insurance, universal coverage. For us to have, however, affordable health care, it requires single payer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to move me rather than risk moving this microphone. Congresswoman Jackie Spear has just joined us, so I am going to invite the Congresswoman to come down. One of the groups that has experienced a tremendous amount of discrimination continuously. Oh, I don't need that microphone. Oh, thank you, Michael. Are, of course, women in the United States. We are still struggling for equal pay for equal work. In 1972, when the original ERA was first passed out of Congress, in general, women earned approximately 76 cents to a man's dollar. Now, in 2014, you will be delighted to know that that number has gone up. It is now 77 cents to a man's dollar. So at that rate, we have a very, very, very long time to go. In May of 2013, H.J. Res 43 was introduced in the House to remove the ratification deadline from the Equal Rights Amendment. In February of 2014, our sponsor left Congress, and we were forced to start all over, finding a new sponsor and getting a new bill. And we were lucky enough to have Congresswoman Jackie Spear step up. Since March 27th of 2014, we now have 122 co-sponsors on our legislation in the House to remove the ratification deadline from the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, as you know, PDA, we do support the three-state strategy, and it's simple math. 3 is less than 38. So, Congresswoman, I'd like to welcome you, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you. It's 24 words. That's all. Equality under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any of the states on account of sex. Pretty simple. And you would think that this would be really a no-brainer. I have 2 documents from the U.S. Archives. They're copies on my wall in my office. One is a letter dated 1917 by the National Association Against Suffrage, signed by 30 or 40 women, who, among many other things, thought that if we gave women the right to vote, that this socialist and suffragist activity would be the downfall of this country, but more importantly, it would make it proper in this country for the officialdom to authorize nagging, believe it or not, among other things. Now, back in 1871, in 1871, there was a group of suffragettes who implored the House of Representatives and the Senate of the United States to give women the right to vote. And among those who signed it were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Now, it took 70 years for women to get the right to vote. 1848, Seneca Falls, Declaration of Sentiments, first orated by then Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the age of 32, who was in the process of having her 7 children. And as the story goes, she would be making soup in the kitchen, and Susan B. Anthony would be sitting at the table taking notes of what Elizabeth Cady Stanton suggested she go out and speak about, because Elizabeth had to stay home with her kids. So I tell you that little bit of history so you can appreciate that, we're not unaccustomed to long battles. But this is getting ridiculous. So this particular measure would take the deadline that was created in the original ERA and erase it. It's in the preamble. It's been reviewed by constitutional lawyers, all of whom say not relevant, easily can disregard it. And the truth is, we passed the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. It took over 202 years for that one to pass because it was a little-known early amendment that prevents the Congress from passing a law to increase its salaries. During its existing Congress, it would apply to future Congresses. And that was just recently passed. So we've got good footing on which to stand, and there have been 35 that have passed the ERA. That means we only need 3 more. Now, there is an issue where 5 rescinded their support for the ERA after they passed it. Buyer's remorse, I guess. Maybe that nagging thing came back to haunt them. In any case, regardless of whether it's 3 or 8, it is a much smaller hill to mount than 38. And it's a real important rallying cry, I think. I think it's also very obvious that women continue to be discriminated against on every level all the time. The most recent story I heard was of a young couple, graduated from the same university, had approximately the same education, although the woman had more experience in the field. They applied to the same nonprofit agency to go to work. They both got jobs there. He was offered a salary that was $5,000 more than she. Now, the reason why she knew all of this is because she was married to her colleague and was able to evaluate and become aware of what the salary differential was. The Lilly Ledbetter Act that we did pass now creates a means by which you can bring an action even though it occurs years prior to your experience. You may remember her case, Goodyear Tire Company, a federal contractor, I might add. She worked there for over 20 years, maybe closer to 30 years, and it was at the end of her time as a manager at that company that someone slipped a note into her locker that kind of just defined the differences in salaries that she was making as compared to her colleagues who were also managers. And then she always said, I always assumed they were doing the right thing. They were a federal contractor. And so she brought the action. The court held, as you may recall, that even though she won in one court and was taken up to the Supreme Court held that even though she didn't know it, she was required to take action, to file against her employer after her first pay period. I mean, how contorted can that get, right? So we have made some improvements, but it doesn't go far enough. And by putting it in the Constitution, it reduces the burden that those that bring actions will have to overcome. And once it's constitutional, once it's a violation of the Constitution, then it becomes much easier for the Supreme Court to take action on it, not having to look back at legislative intent. So with that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to address them. And my colleague, Bobby Rush, has just come in, so Bobby Scott, sorry.
Scott.
Sorry, Bobby. Why did I do that? I know it happens all the time, but I know better.
Well, Congresswoman, if I may, I work with National Nurses United, and of course, you're a hero to the California nurses in particular, because apart from this issue, pioneer on limiting the number of patients nurses required to care for in a hospital, really improving patient safety.
right.
So we thank you for that, being a pioneer on that issue, which again is of course an issue of dignity for women in the workplace as well, right? Not only for patients but for women who nurses historically, the assumption was, well, nurses don't need a pension because their husbands will have it, right? And it's those kind of built-in discriminatory assumptions that I think your effort around this ratification of the ERA really speaks to, is that the daily indignities that women suffer and the institutionalized discrimination they suffer could both be spotlighted during the fight and remedied through constitutional action.
The Affordable Care Act fixed this particular problem, but discrimination in health insurance was rampant before the Affordable Care Act, and being a woman was a pre-existing condition. I mean, the fact that you could charge women more for health care, even though they had healthier lifestyles than their colleague who was of the same age and a male and a smoker, and yet the way the insurance industry had calibrated what was indeed going to be the premium always ended up impacting women in a very difficult way. I'll just tell you one other story about reproductive health and the discrimination that existed. When I was in the state legislature, again, I carried a bill that basically said if you had a prescription drug benefit, that you couldn't discriminate against just one class of drugs by not covering it. And there was only one class of drugs that wasn't covered by insurers in California at the time, and that was none other than contraception. So it took me 4 years to get that bill passed. 1 year, it got to the governor, a Republican governor, then George Deukmejian, who vetoed it under some guise that it costs more. Then the insurance industry did a study and found out actually it only costs about $1 per employee per month, so it was cheaper than having live births. But anyway, it took 4 years, and in the end, I couldn't even take credit for it passing, because that was the year in which Pfizer Pharmaceuticals began manufacturing that little blue pill. And lo and behold, that was automatically covered on prescription drug benefits. So I give all the credit to Pfizer that we finally got that passed in California and signed into law.
Congresswoman, I just wanted to make sure that you knew the ERA is moving forward in the state of Illinois.
It is, indeed.
Yes,
I know
yes.
that.
ERA ratification has passed in the Illinois Senate, so I have to give a shout out to our own Jeannie DeRay in Illinois for leading that through. And it also passed the House Judiciary in Illinois. So the very last step in Illinois will be in the November veto session. And we are planning to be able to get that passed, at which point Illinois will become the first state in the 21st century to ratify the ERA.
That's great news. Great
Thank
news.
Andrea Miller for her work on the jobs bill.
Oh, okay.
HR 1000. I was instructed.
Oh,
to state.
okay. All right, thank
All
you.
right, thank you, Congresswoman Spear.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Thank you.
I think Congressman Conyers and Congressman Scott have votes, and they'll be back to join us in a few minutes after doing those votes. And we really want to thank again Congresswoman Spear for joining us. Thank you so much.
Reverend Yearwood.
Yes.
I'd like to invite Reverend Yearwood of the Hip Hop Caucus to join us at the front and talk about environmental justice, a critical part of promoting household stability. If you do not have clean air, clean water, there's kind of not a whole lot of point. You won't be here with us for very long. Reverend Yearwood, thank you for joining us.
Thank God for the votes. I would have been here for a good bit. First, let me just say it is always good to be in these revered halls.
Sometimes.
No, all the time.
Oh, okay.
No, all the time, because I think for those of us, particularly those of us of a darker hue, it shows that our country is progressing, and that's a good thing. It shows the power of what we can do as Americans, black, white, brown, yellow, male, female, straight and gay, humans, Americans, fighting for a more just, sustainable country. And that's a good thing, because 200 years ago, I could not have walked around these hallways so freely. Neither could Representative Scott or Conyers or Reverend Sadler or Anise, my dear friend from Free DC. None of us could have been that in that aspect. So I want to just make sure and always acknowledge that historical aspect, because that's important in regards to climate change. The climate change issue, in my opinion, and Reverend Sadler from North Carolina will understand this, but the climate change issue is our lunch counter moment for the 21st century. And it is an issue where climate change is a civil rights issue. We have a right to clean water. We have a right to clean air. We have a right so that our children don't die from asthma. We have a right so that our grandmothers can live to 70 and 80 and not 40 and 50. We have a right so that children now around coal-powered plants are now suffering at 3 and 4 neurological problems, as well as children receiving symptoms similar to heart attacks in the 1st and 2nd grade. We have to make this change. Now, the battle here, like most battles, and I just say this, is a battle very similar in regards to organized people versus organized money. Unfortunately, our country is very dependent on fossil fuels, and the companies make billions and billions of dollars in this regard. And so the climate movement has been organizing very much rapidly to literally break down and transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And this is what I want to kind of just say where we are as a movement. The first part of our movement is that we have been very successful over the past 5 years organizing people to beat organized money, which is not that difficult because when we know history, organized people always beat organized money, Joel. And so one of the things there is that people have said, how has the environmental movement been so successful? My hat, No KXL, standing for the No Keystone XL pipeline, the disastrous pipeline trying to tap into the tar sands, which many scientists would say is game over if we release that carbon into the air and build a pipeline, in essence, from one end, from the top of America through the other end, leaving out to Houston, the most vulnerable communities there. But we were able to push that back. My friend Van Jones came to me in amazement saying that this was a done deal in the White House and in the State Department, but we organized against that. The first thing we did to beat that, I think, which PDA can learn from is this. The environmental movement was a very siloed movement, very Birkenstock, very white-led movement. And so we had to first make sure that the movement can come together. On the other side, the environmental justice side, the African American or Latino side of the movement was very bitter. Bitter for a reason, but very bitter. And the bitterness would not allow for the silos to be broken down. So on one side of the coin, you had NRDC, Sierra Club, Earth Justice, and going on. The other side, you had EJ groups, and they would not come together. So we were able to break down those silos, and also we were able to empower communities in the state, such as the Native American communities in South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, and so forth. Breaking down those silos, not operating in a spirit of just charity, in which it's a very much horizontal, vertical, but moving in solidarity with a horizontal approach. So that was the first step. We were able to then push back the Keystone XL pipeline. Second thing we have to do is definitely move from the suites to the streets. While we understand the power here in Capitol Hill, we began to organize aggressively in the communities, just like those who were on the other side were doing. This allowed us to grow numbers in great and large aspects. So we were able to then get college students engaged, seniors engaged, people of color, traditional environmentalists engaged, coming together in large numbers. The third thing that was important is that our movement dealing with civil rights and civil justice stopped being so civil. And so we had to again begin to move, and we began to return to nonviolence tactics. I know Maura Mondays have been doing a wonderful job to that, but we did more than that. The environmental movement, for example, Sierra Club in its over 120-year history never endorsed a civil disobedience until February 13, 2014. When we did that, myself, Julian Bond, Bill McKibben, many Nobel Peace Prize winners were arrested at the White House. That was an important transition. On top of that, we began to organize in large numbers. We had the largest rally on February 17th, in which we brought 40,000 people to Washington, D.C. in the bitter cold for the Forward on Climate rally. Didn't stop there. We began to then hit the fossil fuel industry where it hurts in their pocketbook. We began to put forth a strong divestment campaign. It started in 2012 with about 3 or 4 college campuses. Since that time, there are now over 400 college campuses who have active divestment movements building on their campuses. Schools such as Stanford and others have now divested their portfolio from fossil fuels. So where we are now, this leads us to September 20th. Actually, before that, since I see my brother Steve here, Steve Schaff, locally. There are many battles that are going on within our movement. So locally, there's a battle against liquefied natural gas, LNG, and we're stopping against fracking. There will be a battle called Stop Cove Point here in D.C. On July 13th with our group from Chesapeake Climate Action Network. I would advise PDA to be a part of that process. And then from there, we go into building, which we're now building, which is the largest climate since Earth Day in 1970. We are going to New York City during the UN discussions to bring what we hope is over 250,000 people into the streets of New York City on September 20th and 21st. That will probably be a game changer. It will probably be what many are saying could break the backs of the fossil fuel industry in their place in New York City, where Wall Street is. That is where we are leading to. And we intend to break their backs in September as well. So I ask all of you to be a part of that. It's called the People's Climate Rally in March. I would ask all of you to participate, to be a part of that, to join with us as we move forward. As I said when I started, as I'm in D.C., I'll close with this. We just got finished doing our Hip Hop Caucus Act on Climate tour, Joe, as you know. You went to the one at Howard, over at Howard University. That's right. And UDC. But one of the things there is that we would ask the audience this question. We had about at least 340 people, mostly African Americans there. The one thing I would say is this, and I'm glad Representative Scott was here and Congressman Conyers, me and Congressman Conyers wrote an article together on no KXL. You all should read that if you're looking more for KXL. But when we went around, I would ask the audience, if you know somebody with asthma, raise your hands. And then, well, there you go. That's what they did there too. And then I would ask them, I said, if you know somebody if you or know somebody who has cancer, stand to your feet. And then people would stand up. If you know somebody with cancer, stand to your feet. Let's actually see here. Let's actually do it. If you know somebody with cancer, there you go. Now, in that audience, it was about 99% African American. The whole audience stood up. And I'd ask this question. Before you sit down, I would then say, if you know somebody who has died from asthma or cancer, have a seat. And that is what would happen. That would happen. It is a crisis. And I just will say this as somebody who buried a young girl here in D.C., as a matter of fact, a 14-year-old girl who was the honor roll student, Joe, over in Southeast. She was like one of, I think, 8 or 9. And she was a good one, you know, it was a little rough camp in that household. But she was the one who helped Mama do everything. You know that one, who would change and do everything. But she had asthma. And her mother had to play Russian roulette. Do I pay this bill, or do I get this baby an inhaler? And, you know, she would play that game. And then she lost Russian roulette. Her baby had an asthma attack and died. The one good baby. Not too far from where we sit right now, over in the Southeast. And while I was doing that funeral the entire time, that mother was trying to climb into that casket. Sisters and uncles and aunts were pulling her out of the casket. At one time, I was tipping the casket over, trying to lay this baby to rest. What kind of country do we live in when we allow our babies to choke to death because we won't regulate our air? So this is not a game. And we have to change that. Now, I can't bring that baby back. And I probably can't bring some of your family back who died from cancer or asthma. But we as sure hell can create policy and shape policy. Because we know either we shape policy or policy will shape us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, we know that PDA, Progressive Democrats of America, will be participating in that People's Climate Rally in March on September 20th and 21st.
And Cove Point.
And Cove Point. And National Nurses United as well will be there. And the New York State Nurses Association, I know, are involved in that organizing as well. And that the public health issue that Reverend Yearwood had so poignantly described is really coming to the fore in how we deal with and talk about these climate justice, environmental justice issues. And as nurses and all of us know, our health is sacred, as is the earth, and those two things are what we're really ultimately fighting for. So who do we want to go next?
All right, well, we have not really spoken about voting rights yet, so we're going to address a rather interesting and somewhat perverse topic. I'm going to ask Anise Jenkins to come up front, and we're going to talk a little bit about the city of Washington, D.C., the home of the federal government, that does not have any senators because they are not a state. And also,
Anise, can we just excuse you just for a second?
We're going to bring in Congressman
Thank you.
Scott.
I apologize.
Thank you, Anise. Thank you, Anise. Bobby, come on down. Come on down. All right, we always so delighted to see you, Congressman.
Good, Bobby Scott.
Congressman Bobby Scott is from Richmond, Virginia, so he is from Central Virginia. And one of the teams that I lead at in PDA is the en masse criminalization team. And we have endorsed Congressman Scott's legislation, H.R. 1695, the Justice Safety Valve Act. And I invited the congressman to come and speak to us about that bill and why that bill is really important as it relates to civil rights. So, Congressman Scott.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you for all that you do. You're very active in Virginia, making sure that the issues get addressed. That's one of the problems we have around here. People kind of breeze by issues, and nobody is held accountable. You can see that in Richmond today as they're discussing the Medicaid expansion. People just say, well, I'm against Obamacare, and that's all they need to deny 400,000 people their coverage, notwithstanding the fact that we've already paid our taxes. It generates more money for the general fund than it takes out. Jobs created, and they give no credible response. And so your work makes sure that people have to give credible responses to the complex issues. You've mentioned, I mean, and this group is talking about immigration and healthcare and voting rights and everything else that needs to be addressed. And the fact that you're working hard to focus on these issues makes it possible to really be able to legislate. You mentioned criminal justice system. I've been working in criminal justice. I've been in Congress for 22 years. I was in the state legislature for 15 years before that, most of that time on the courts, what's called Courts of Justice Committee, the Virginia equivalent of the Judiciary Committee. And I found over that period of time, you really have a choice. You can reduce crime or you can play politics. Unfortunately, you can't do both. And we're good at both when we set our mind to it, but the pollsters tell us that the politics, all the simple-minded slogans, 3 strikes and you're out, life without parole, mandatory minimums is one of the worst culprits, and that's how we got in a situation where we're in, where we lock up a higher portion of our population than any country on earth by far. Pew Research says that any incarceration rate over 350, you're getting diminishing returns for your investment. And anything over 500 is actually counterproductive. You're messing up so many families, you're wasting so much money, you got so many people with felony records, can't find jobs, that over 500 you're actually adding to crime. Well, the United States average is over 700. Nowhere, you know, all up there by ourselves. African American, 2,200. 10 states lock up blacks at the rate of 4,000 per 100,000. 500 and above, counterproductive. I mean, what kind of sense does that make? We know that we got so many people in locked up today that the Children's Defense Fund calls it the cradle to prison pipeline. Some have identified some school policies like zero tolerance and some other good vote-getting slogans that create a school to prison pipeline. When we know that if we have a comprehensive, evidence-based, locally tailored strategy, you can reduce crime and save money in the process. Basically get people on, not in the cradle to prison pipeline, but in a cradle to college and career pipeline. And constructing that pipeline is actually cheaper than constructing the cradle to prison pipeline. Mandatory minimums is one of the culprits that adds to the cradle to prison pipeline, over incarceration. It requires that, and it's a silly way to sentence people, because you're actually sentencing them in the legislature before the crime has been committed. You don't know what the crime is. All you know is the code section. And let me tell you we had one hearing where I asked a guy, well, code section that covers a 19-year-old and a 15-year-old high school students having consensual sex is in the same code section with a 50-year-old having sex with a 13-year-old. And at one point, one of the times that code section went through, we were talking about life without parole. Mandatory, life without parole. For two, you know, maybe that's works for the 50 and the 13, but it's not so hot for 2 high school students. But you're sentenced on the code section, not by the judge that has heard the evidence, evaluated the case, and imposed the sentence and makes common sense. As soon as the prosecutor lays down the charge, that's it. And the charge is based on what the legislature has. No role in the crime, and these drug crimes are worse. No, it's weight of the drug in the conspiracy. This is where the girlfriends get all messed up, because the boyfriend's dealing a ton of crack, and they took a phone call or drove somebody to a deal, and all of a sudden, the judge has to look up on the matrix and ton of crack. Well, that's what you get. Doesn't have anything to do with the role in the operation or anything. Mandatory minimum. These sentences violate common sense. You got girlfriends getting sentences that kidnappers don't even get, murderers. Just violate common sense. So there are 2 bills that are floating around. One is the Safety Valve Act, and the other is the Smarter Sentencing Act. The Safety Valve Act just says that if a court concludes that the sentence violates the normal standards of sentencing, that is, the seriousness of the crime, deterrent effect, and those kinds of things, if it violates the sentencing standards, that you can sentence based on what makes common sense. Not complicated. You can impose a sentence that makes common sense. Who's against that? Well, all of them. I mean, this is what we're dealing with. We have a little smaller bill that just doesn't eliminate any mandatory minimums, just kind of rolls them back a little bit, so that people aren't caught up in the draconian punishments. They're just bad punishments, but doesn't eliminate it. It's a modest little thing, a step in the right direction. They marked it up in the Senate. Now, there's this thing called the law of holes. If you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you ought to do is stop digging. Well, by the time the bill to reduce mandatory minimums came out of the Senate committee, they added mandatory minimums to the bill. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, we're trying to convince people that mandatory minimums are inherently reprehensible because they never work. They're always at some time require a judge to impose a sentence that doesn't make any sense. And here you go, adding some more mandatory minimums to it. The RAND Corporation has studied mandatory minimums. They find they do not reduce crime. They discriminate against minorities. They waste the taxpayers' money, and they frequently require judges to impose sentences that violate common sense. That's the reason you vote against them. I don't know why you would vote for them. And one of the problems with all of this is nobody's asking them. You can vote as stupid on crime as you want, and you never have to ask a question. If you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. That's been studied. It increases the crime rate. Everybody knows it. And so I vote no. And so the press comes running to me, why'd you vote no? I said, because it increased crime and everybody knows it. Oh, okay. Anybody ask somebody, why'd you vote for it? No. Anybody ask somebody, mandatory minimums waste the taxpayers' money, don't do anything about crime, discriminate against minorities? Anybody ever ask somebody, why'd you vote for it? No. And so the political calculation is there's no downside to voting stupid on crime, and there's plenty of downside because if you don't get to explain your answer, all they know is you're soft on crime. And so there's an old adage in politics, when you're explaining, you're losing. Any vote you got to explain, you don't want to cast. And so they vote, they don't have to explain it. We need groups like this to call people and say, why'd you vote for the mandatory minimum when it wastes the taxpayers' money, discriminates against minorities, doesn't do anything about crime, and violates common sense? What part of that are you for? And ask. And I think if you got enough going to town hall meetings and challenge people on it and get the press, push the press to ask the questions, to explain why you voted for something that is demonstrably stupid, particularly when you have alternatives. I've introduced the Youth Promise Act, which is more of a process than a program. The process is you get the community together. You, first of all, figure out what the status quo is. How much money are you wasting on counterproductive incarceration? How much money are you spending on teen pregnancy-related Medicaid and social services? Because if you have a good primary prevention plan, you can reduce everything. You're going to reduce crime, drug use, teen pregnancy, suicide, dropouts. You can reduce everything. So put those numbers on the table. Some communities will be shocked because that number will look about the same order of magnitude as the school board budget. Maybe not quite as big, but same number of digits. Then come up with an evidence-based plan to do something about it. Locally tailored, and you put evidence-based in there. Well, as opposed to what? As opposed to the slogans and sound bites that the buffoons would put in there if you didn't put evidence-based. And then what the Youth Promise Act will do is pay for the planning, because some of these numbers don't exist. How much money are you spending in incarceration? Nobody can tell you, because nobody cares. We had a drug roundup a couple of years ago in Portsmouth where the ringleader got 50 years, the next guy got 35 years. Yay! How many people do you think multiplied 50 times $30,000 got $1.5 million, and 35 times 30 got over $1 million? Did that judge just essentially appropriated $2.5 million in the same city that couldn't fund the Boys and Girls Clubs? Who made that decision? Well, nobody cares. And so some of these numbers don't even exist. You got to go find them somewhere and find out what the status quo is. We'll pay for the evaluation and the planning, evidence-based. And then as you run the programs, we'll pay for the programs once. And as you evaluate it as you go along, and all these people you had around the table, see who's saving some money. And as they save the money, they say, well, I don't have any money. As they save the money, make them kick back a little bit. Not all of it, just some of it. If you can get a little piece of it, you can keep the programs running, because Pennsylvania did some evidence-based comprehensive plans around the state, about 100 plans, spent $60 million on some plans. We look back a couple of years later, that spent $60 million, that saved $300 million. We had a little program in Richmond where the murder rate in that community went from 19 down to 2. Cost $2.5 million. We probably saved that at the Medical College of Virginia, just in indigent care for gunshot wounds that they didn't, because everybody that's murdered, you got about 4 or 5 times more didn't die, got to be treated. All those people didn't get shot. All those services recaptured. Department of Corrections, you're sending so many people, not sending so many people to get Department of Corrections to kick some back in. Get social services and Medicaid to kick back in from all the teen pregnancy reduction. So reinvestment. So once we've done it once, you're on your own after that. These programs work. I mean, Boston did one where they reduced the number of juvenile murders from about 13 a year down to 0 for 3 consecutive years. I mean, these prevention programs work. It's been documented. That's why we don't mind putting evidence-based in there. So we know what to do. And here we got this simple-minded foolishness over here, mandatory minimums and all kinds of slogans. And that's what we're actually voting on, and nobody's calling them on it. So when you have organizations, Andrea, like yours, that are calling them on it, introducing and endorsing bills, it was easy to get me here to talk about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And it's nice to have, and it's an honor to be able to get here just a couple of minutes before the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, who has been a stalwart on all of the issues, all of the progressive issues. He actually voted on Medicare and Medicaid and the Voting Rights Act and impeaching Nixon. He has been in the fight for decades, and it's certainly an honor to serve on the Judiciary Committee with John Conyers from Michigan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Congressman Conyers, come on down.
Oh, okay.
It's your turn.
I'm not sure we can introduce you any better than that. But you are, of course, a champion for the issues that all of us care about at Progressive Democrats of America, from healthcare justice to the criminal justice issues we've discussed and full employment. So thank you so much for being here.
What an honor to be with the Progressive Democrats of America and to follow Chairman Bobby Scott. Give him another round of applause. I'm trying to think of something he may have left out of his presentation. And the only thing that I see, and he may have mentioned this before I got here, is that we are trying to restore the voting rights of everybody that is incarcerated when they get out.
Amen.
Yes.
That is very, very critical. And it's in that spirit that I continue the discussion that Chairman Scott has raised in his work, both as a lawyer, as a member of the Virginia legislature, and as a chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. We're very proud of him. And I'd like to talk about the beginning of my coming to Washington when I got Dr. Martin Luther King to give me his endorsement because I worked with him and Rosa Parks, who moved to Detroit and worked with me for many years. I also have a former staff member that has been with me for many years that is still active. And even though he's not up here anymore, he still comes to these meetings. He's still a progressive. And to me, this is what our activity is all about. How do we, Andrea, move more people to political activity? And I think that's a very important question because we have a number of people who've given up on getting anything out of the voting process. And the ballot is what controls everything that we do. And so I spend a fair amount of time trying to persuade people to, first of all, register to vote. But even after that, after you're registered, you've got to get out and vote yourself. And that sometimes becomes difficult. We're in some very turbulent times now. And when I pick up the paper, I keep wondering what we're doing in Syria, how are things in the Ukraine, whether or not Crimea has there been something that keep urging the conservatives to pound on the table and demand that the president send in a military force to strike and to have boots on the ground, as they like to say. We want to use diplomacy, and so far, President Obama's been very skillful in doing that. He says we're not sending in troops, and why? Well, Korea and Vietnam are both examples. Once you send in troops, you never get out. You get stuck, and that's a very easy lesson for us to learn. But it's hard for an administration to practice when people are saying you ought to do something, you ought to teach them a lesson. You ought to send in a military presence to show them a thing or two that we're serious. And we are, without question, the most powerful, the most militarized. We have more weapons of destruction than any other country by far. And so there is always that temptation for those who want to prove America's might that we have people urging us to take that position.
But Congressman Conyers, why don't we have any jobs?
Well, that's a good question. We have jobs, but we don't have enough jobs.
Well, that's right. How do we get more?
Well, there's a little.
R1000.
Yeah, in which I have 57 co-sponsors, which I'm very proud of. Now, the whole notion behind the full employment jobs bill is based on a simple premise that as the wealthiest country in history. There is no reason why we can't create full employment and a job for everybody in America that wants to work. And remember, we have more wealth than anyone, any other country, and it's very important that we believe in and develop the philosophy that the wealthiest country in history should be able to create jobs for everyone that needs them. Now, it's almost simplistic to argue that because of the fact that people are looking for work and our unemployment rates are very deceptive. Actually, we have more people not working that want to than we know about, because we have a number of people who have given up looking for a job. So they reduce the unemployment rate. And then we have a number of people working part-time that want to work full-time. And so when you put those together, you can see we have a lot to do. Now, juxtapose that with the fact that there are many projects. You start off with our infrastructure, our roads and highways, our bridges. Someone just told me that there is a high percentage of bridges in the United States that are dangerous to cross. I remember the figure of 22%, but I don't want to put it out as a statistic but I think that's what it was. Now that's shocking. It was shocking to me when I found out about it. And so what we're doing, Andrea, is trying to get the president and the administration, and his legacy is going to be measured by this one thing: how many jobs and what kind of programs was he able to get through during his last couple years as one of the outstanding presidents of the United States. And what we have to do is to continue to push that. Now, it's a funny thing. All legislation works the same way. First of all, you write a bill. And sometimes you write a bill not knowing how long it's going to take. And sometimes you don't even ask yourself that. When Dr. King was assassinated, I thought of, right after his assassination, I remember trying to figure out what is the highest honor that we could pay the person that I personally found his ideology, his oratory, his writing, and his action, his commitment to the things that he wrote about. How could they be best celebrated and remembered? What kind of legacy could we leave? And it was, to me, very simple. There should be a holiday in his honor, honoring Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And people, a number of people, even some that joined me on the bill said, well, put my name on the bill, but you know, King can't get a holiday, in this country. But sign me up anyway. But enough people did it, and it took a number of years, and we finally got it. And it was a tribute. for me, it was a tribute to the greatest political figure that I have ever had the honor of meeting and working with. And so we have a long way to go. I want to conclude with just observation about the South. And I say this even though Chairman Scott is Virginia is technically in the South.
Virginia is the South, Michigan is not.
Well, most of Michigan is not. What we have,
As long as you're south of the Canadian border.
that's right, it's south of Canada. What we have here is a very interesting development, and I hope the progressives take this subject up soon, and I'd like to be here and join in, is that the South, now that people are registering and voting in the South, there is now a predominance in some places of African American support that has never existed before. And people, it's beginning to show up and pay off. We have cities now. Well, there are far more African American mayors and local elected officials in the South than in the North. And I think the reason is that the Voter Rights Act and our emphasis on voter rights and participation is beginning to pay off. And it's I think, having a very beneficial and positive effect in places in the South. I was reading something about Mississippi, which you may remember, that the leaders at the time of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voter Rights Act of 65, their leaders were saying, never. Who was the member that stood at the schoolyard door?
Wallace.
George Wallace, who said that you never come through here. And now there is, now that we've gone through that period of reluctantly coming around to the fact that the laws have to apply to everybody. It's got to be fairness. And we started off, this country started off without, we had great language, soaring constitutional promises, but guess what? They didn't apply to people of African descent. And, you know, it's shocking to think that George Washington had slaves. But he was talking about the rights of every man to be free and equality of opportunity. And so that, to me, is a sign of how far we've really come. And we went through, after...
We need to.
Okay,
Our time
wrap
is
up.
drawing short.
Okay, 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute.
After the Civil War, guess what? We had the Emancipation Proclamation, but at the same time, we came in with segregation. They said, well, we've amended the Constitution, but we're still going to believe in separate but equal. And that held till 1954, until the Supreme Court said, you can't have separate but equal. If you have separate, you have unequal. And so it's out of Brown versus the Board of Education that we were able to move this forward. And now we're looking, I conclude with this sentence. We are now looking at the global implications of everybody being equal and fair. And on the African continent, there's a great deal of inquiry and investigation and discussion that I hope the progressives will consider when we continue these very important examinations of how we move not only the people of this country forward, but the people in the 54 countries on the African continent who are still in a very difficult situation. Thank you for your kindness.
Thank you, Congressman. So I think we want to, we're going to run a little bit over time, but we wanted to make sure that we heard from a local activist on statehood and voting rights for the District of Columbia, who was kind enough to defer to the members of Congress. Thank you, Congressman Scott.
Thank you, Congressman
And,
Scott.
no, that's all right. Thank you, Congressman. Great to see you.
Pleasure, Mr. Lightly.
So we're,
Andre Miller.
so we're going to bring up Anise Jenkins. If we could just have a little bit of quiet, please. We're going to finish up our program. And if you want to say anything more about
Come on up, Anise. Okay, everybody, if you could take your seats. Ooh. See, now they've got to tell them goodbye.
All right, we're going to continue. We're going to continue and wind up here. Our webcast folks continuing on.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, Anise.
All right, and Anise, thank you so much for joining us. Anise is with Stand Up for Democracy DC. So as I was saying, DC is the home of our federal government. However, they have no senators, and while they do have a representative, they have a representative whose votes on the floor technically don't really count, which means they don't really have representation. So Anise, go ahead and take it away.
All right. I want to thank Andrea and the Progressive Democrats of America for inviting me to come here. People come from all over the country, all over the world to the United States Congress, and you rarely hear that they are actually in a place where over 640,000 people reside who do not share in the democracy that our country promotes and talks about so much. So I really want to thank you for including me in this program. As Andrea said earlier, tomorrow is June 19th. That is called Juneteenth. The date that marks the day that the last enslaved were informed that the Civil War was over and that they were freed. Now, today is June 18th, 2014. And DC residents, as I said, now over 640,000 people, now growing at 1,100 per month. More populous than Vermont and Wyoming, are still fighting for our freedom to be treated with fair and equal justice and due process. We are determined to be free and equal. DC residents are the only citizens in this country that pay federal taxes, and actually the highest federal taxes per person in the country, who have absolutely no voting representation in their legislative body. We are the only country out of over 175 countries in the world whose citizens who reside in their capital have no representation in the capital legislative body. Washington is the only capital that does that. Therefore, if we don't have a vote in the Congress, we have no say-so in the national decisions on how we will live our lives. We have no voting representation on how we actually, to the bottom line, will spend our own local budget made out of our own local earned tax dollars. We have no say-so over who will serve as our local judges, over our local laws, and those laws are subject to change or to even be abolished by the Congress at any time, for any reason, or for no reason at all. Sometimes we find out that the reason is that the congressperson may be running on an issue at home, such as gun control, anti-abortion, or whatever, that DC residents, because we are very progressive, DC residents are very progressive, and we are being punished while they're running at home fighting that issue there. Okay, now just think, it wasn't too long ago that the DC local budget, made out of, again, I keep repeating, our local tax dollars that we paid, took out of our pocket, was threatened to be shut down because the federal government was shut down. Now, how did this happen? How did a local government get mixed up in all of this fighting that was going on with the federal government? How did it happen? How could Congress even think about doing this? Because we are treated as part of the federal government. It's not fair, it's not right, and it must end. Now, going back to the Civil War, I got it on my mind. November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address that our form of government, democracy, is defined as government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the people during that time were fiercely fighting to preserve it. In 2014, the people of DC are pressing on to achieve that goal of democracy. However, now we are subject to government by over 500 elected officials that we didn't elect, and basically we don't know, and they don't know us. We must become the 51st state to constitutionally and legally attain democracy in the non-federal part of Washington, D.C. The new Columbia Admissions Act, H.R. 292, was introduced by our non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, originally in 2010, and has been reintroduced in the 113th Congress, again by our non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, in the 113th Congress in 2013. We now have, due to the work of our delegate, due to the work of local organizations, individuals, people who are fighting for what they deserve, we now have 67 co-sponsors of that bill. Now, 67 out of 400 and whatever is not enough. 435 is not enough. We need more support. We need people to understand the situation, understand that this is a hole in the heart of the democracy of our nation. This is not right. It affects our local health care. It affects our education. It affects every aspect of how we live our lives here in the nation's capital. And it truly does affect how our country is seen around the world. Don't think that they don't know, because they do. We have been criticized in the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and it will continue until we get the support of all democracy and progressive lovers of our country.
All right, Anise, one of the things that PDA can do is I will bring Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill to the attention of the Election Integrity Commission, our election integrity issue team for endorsement. And then I will look to get that endorsed by our issue team, at which point then we will be able to put it in a future Educate Congress letter.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
So I guess the question is, when will emancipation come to the District of Columbia?
As Dr. King said, the arc of justice bends, the moral arc of justice,
The moral arc of history bends
history
towards
bends towards justice.
That's right.
and he also said, how long? Not long.
Exactly.
So we're going to keep on pushing, keep
Hear,
on
hear.
fighting,
Yes.
and it's going to happen. It's the right thing.
It's the right thing. Thank you so much, and thank you
Thank
for.
you again for inviting me.
Thank you.
So I want to give Andrea the last word, and thank you all for coming. Thank our folks on the webcast for participating. Extraordinary event that you organized, Andrea, and I think it really goes to the heart of what PDA is about.
Thank you very much, Michael, for being my co-host. I want to thank all the PDA people that are watching. As you know, we are organized into issue teams. So if your issue is economic justice, healthcare, the environment, equal rights opportunity, elections, and voting, please visit our website at www.pdamerica.org. PDA will continue this fight on many, 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 many fronts. We are growing our organization. We are going and reaching out to many, many diverse communities so that we can add that strength of community that Reverend Yearwood mentioned, and so that all of our movements united can grow and expand horizontally. Thank you all for joining us. Good afternoon.
Congratulations.
You're very welcome. Thank you. And I have a